Be seated. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So the Super Bowl was last Sunday. Seattle Seahawks won 29-13. You know, there are some issues that we can talk about in the church, and some issues we just better... Oh, but you know, wasn't it? Poetry in motion. It's like chess on a football field, except with shoulder pads and very hard hitting. The most important sports event in the country each year. And then, last week and this week are the Olympics. Oh, you want to talk about poetry in motion? These people and the things they can do up high in the air and spinning around. Oh, it's glorious. Glorious. The most prestigious sports event in the world. The most capable people at doing these beautiful dances on ice and flips in the air, the most capable of the species. Glorious. But really, where does the glory come from? Where does the glory of the Super Bowl come from? Does it really come from the glitz and the glam and the money and the grandeur? Or does it come from the skill and the perception and the quarterback's immediate creativity when the plan falls apart? And does it come from the fact that the Seahawks won not just because they overcame their opponents, but because they overcame their opponents while obeying the rules? Does it come from the fact that it touches something deep inside of us? Something that has to do with exuberance and energy and competitiveness and aggressiveness and strength. So we feel drawn. Or the Olympics. Does it come from the pageantry and the adulation? Or does it come from the fact that these people remind us of how magnificent and beautiful our own bodies are? Because what you see on that screen is what God has made inside of you. However old you are, however capable you are, whatever your skills are, this is what we were created as. Glory. What is glory? The gospel lesson for today, Jesus brings Peter, James, and John up on a mountain, and they see his glory. Now they're going to need that because they're coming down off the mountain and they're going to Jerusalem where Jesus will be crucified. They will need that glory. Just like we need to be reminded of the glory of God and the laughter of God and the beauty of God and the power of God that is within us and around us. That's why we come to church, to be reminded of the glory, so that we do not lose heart, so that we do not turn on ourselves. Now Peter, James, and John, they see Jesus' face shining bright as the sun. They see his clothes dazzling white. And Moses and Elijah are there, these two fundamental pillars of how the Jewish people see God and understand the world. Fundamental pillars of the community, pillars of the culture. They see them right there. And Peter wants to stay. I mean, after all, Moses got to stay in the presence of God for 40 days. Why can't he stay for a while? Well, Lord, it is good that we be here. I'm going to build you 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Okay. Honestly, if somebody who had lots of glory came to your door, wouldn't you invite them in for a cup of coffee? Right? If Taylor Swift showed up at your door, what would you do? Well, some of us would melt, but in the glory of it, Or if Mozart were somehow brought back from the dead and showed up at your door, wouldn't you want to bring him inside and just say hello for a while? Lord, it is good for you to be here. Let's stay a while. And God interrupts him. God says, this is my son. This is my voice in the world. What he says, I'm saying. What he does, I do. That was what a son was. It was your voice in another place. It was your presence in another place. Jesus is the presence of God on this earth. This is my son. What he says, I say. What he does, I do. I am pleased with him. He is beloved to me. What he is doing is making me happy. I'm proud of him. Now listen. Listen to what he says. Oh boy. So what has Jesus been saying at this point in the Gospel of Matthew? In the verses immediately before the gospel lesson for today, Jesus asked the disciples, who do you say that I am? And Peter says to him, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, the presence of God on earth. And Jesus gives Peter a glorious title. Peter has given Jesus a glorious title, the Messiah, and Jesus gives Peter a glorious title. He says, I'm going to build my church on this affirmation, on this relationship that Jesus is the Messiah. And then Jesus tells us what it means for him to be the Messiah. And y'all know what's coming, right? He says that the Son of Man will be rejected and will suffer greatly at the hands of the chief priests and elders, the hands of the people who are most influential, the hands of the people who control the glory. He's going to suffer at their hands. I cannot emphasize to a sufficiently great extent what an absolute gut punch this must have been to Peter and James and John and to the other disciples, to everybody who was listening. An absolute gut punch. This was an overturning of their expectations, absolutely. All of the writings about the Messiah at this point in Jewish history talk about the Messiah as a mighty leader, a strong man who will use the power of God to drive out the Romans and put the Jews in charge, and at last everything will be run properly. And Jesus says that the Son of Man will be killed and have to depend upon God to raise him back again from the dead. The Messiah does not suffer. Suffering is weak. The Messiah is not killed. The Messiah doesn't have to depend upon God to raise him back from the dead. The Messiah uses the power of God to keep from being killed in the first place. What are you talking about, Jesus? This is what it means for him to be the Messiah. So Peter is absolutely shocked, and he says, Jesus, God forbid that this should be. And Jesus turns around and says, get behind me, Satan. Not such a glorious title anymore. He says, get behind me, Satan. You are thinking in the ways of people and not of God. God thinks differently than we do. And then he says to his followers, he says, anyone who wants to come after me must take up their cross and follow me. Which means that we, the body of Christ, as Paul calls us, we in the world can expect to be rejected by those who wield the glory. Sometimes we are going to suffer at the hands of people who have influence and power and money. Sometimes we will be killed as congregations, as institutions. Sometimes, and this happens in the world, not too often here in the United States, we thank God for that, but it happens elsewhere, sometimes as individuals. We have to trust God to raise us back again from the dead. What God does to us every day. God will do when it's time. What is glory? Jesus brings the love of God to us at the cross. So the love of God, Jesus brings the love of God to us also in the places where we celebrate, where we are poetry in motion in whatever way we might be able to be. And also in the places where we are broken and humiliated and lost. That's what Jesus does. He brings the love of God to us there. And that is glory. We also, as a church, is what we do. We bring the love of God to one another and to the world. In the places of celebration and of glitz and glam and sparkly beads is great. And the places of capability and celebration and achievement, like the Olympics, where we have poetry in motion, whether of the mind or the body or the spirit, all of that, we bring the love of God there. And we also bring the love of God to the places in our world and in our souls, in our own selves, and in our neighbors, and in our enemies, where we are broken and humiliated, and lost, and in despair, and also where we are cruel and vindictive and petty and cowardly and evil. That's what Jesus does. That's what we do. That's glory. And we need to know. We need to be reminded. We need to watch for those moments when we see the light in the midst of the glory. We need to be reminded, like Peter, James, and John are in the gospel lesson for today, that this is beautiful. That the love of God is deeper than anything. That the celebration is made deeper by the love of God. That the grief is made less sharp by the love of God, because the laughter of God runs beneath it all. That it will be okay in the end. We need to watch for those moments. That's part of why we come to church. But church is not the only place. For example, I'll give you two examples. One little and one a little bit bigger. One example. This week, one of the days of this week, I was sad. I was sad because I just talked to somebody who was leaving the church. And this happens in church life. Folks come and they go. I'm always sad when somebody leaves. But then I called Trey. I asked Trey if I could talk about him today. I called up Trey to check and see whether he really would be able to help us with the living room conversations, which we're going to have this year, hopefully one in May and one in September. And he said, yeah, I think I can do that, and that's really nice. But then we got talking about swimming, which he swims in high school, and I swam in high school, so we have a thing about swimming. And he mentioned his letter jacket. He has a letter jacket. And I said, I still have my letter jacket from high school. And we decided we would bring our letter jackets together and wear them last Sunday at church. And that's what we did. And it was fun. And that's glory. That's friendship. That's exuberance. That's celebration. That's glory. Reflects the love of God. So another example. So watch out. Watch out for those little moments, okay? Down in the valley, you don't have to be on a mountaintop to see the glory. God is always with us. But here's another one. It's a little bit bigger. And you may have heard about this. But these Buddhist monks, 18 Buddhist monks, started out in Fort Worth, Texas. Yes, they do have a Buddhist center in Fort Worth, Texas. And they started out on this walk, and they walked across the South to Washington, D.C. Now, this walk was not in order to support or oppose any particular political party, okay? Which sometimes God calls us to make our best discernments about political parties. That's fine. But it was not about that. And it wasn't about any particular policy either, even though God sometimes requires us to support or oppose some particular policy. That's not what it was about this time. It was simply a walk for peace, for people's peace of mind, for peace, around and about peace. And it wasn't safe, not entirely. In fact, early on in the walk, they were walking on these little highways in the back country. Early on, a driver who was distracted ran into one of their accompanying cars and injured two of the monks to the extent that one of them had to have his leg amputated. wasn't saved. But they kept going. They kept walking. You would think, perhaps, that in the South, in these little bitty towns in the South, on these back roads, people would look askance at these 18 strange-looking fellows from Thailand, I think it was. Some of them were from Thailand, wearing saffron and ochre robes, walking through their town for peace. You would think they might look askance at them, but they did not. People showed up by the thousands. In the thousands. And they offered them water and food and a place for them to sleep outside, because they were sleeping outside in tents. This is October, November, and December. The police departments in the towns through which they went gave them little pins. And the leader of the monks wore the pins on a cloth that he had on his robes to indicate their participation, these police departments' participation in their walk for peace. There was a woman whose husband was a police officer in New York City. And her husband died in 9/11. And she gave them his badge to carry with them. Okay? That's glory. That's the glory of God. And we do disagree with the Buddhists on various fundamental, essential realities, but we can still see the glory of God in some of the things they do. They sometimes can see the glory of God or the peace of God in some of the things we do. Keep your eyes open. Watch for the glory. We need it. Thanks be to God.